first Zen story is sort of an analogy or a parable about an aspect of life. It's called Jewel of Forgetfulness. And in that story, Zen, in his task as a mercenary, has to do a task that's kind of distasteful to him. At the end of the story, the object that he was to retrieve was called the Jewel of Forgetfulness, and he places it on his forehead and immediately forgets this distasteful task that he accomplished.
Growing up in the woods, I had a fear of being abducted by aliens. These are the actual woods. Any light I saw streaking across the sky at night was sure to be my future alien oppressors. My fear was born out of that combination of living in the woods and less than Spielbergian-like aliens at the time. The aliens of that era kinda had more in common with the shark from Jaws than E.T. or the aliens from Close Encounters. Hey, there's a letter in here from Sean Kiley from Pittsburgh, PA. At the time, aliens were mysterious entities on X-Files, or straight up monsters that fire in the sky. What is arguably the greatest horror film ever made? It's called Alien. Although E.T. was a big deal, the view of most aliens in pop culture were gray humanoid creatures who were going to dissect us in their spaceships. One day, I came across this comic book that featured a very different kind of alien. One that was actually friendly, maybe a bit sarcastic, but still friendly. Beyond that, he was a ninja. And while he may or may not have abducted a child, he had the specific tagline of Defend the Earth. He was Zen Intergalactic Ninja. I actually bought it here. This Walmart used to be Value City in the Highlands Mall. This is where I bought Zen Issue 0, my first ever independent comic. This comic book, when I first got it, came with a certificate of authenticity. None of my other comic books had that, therefore they were all inauthentic. Also, it was signed by Bill Mouse. It was encased in plastic. Imagine this, encased in plastic. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And it was in the toy aisle, where I'd buy my Ninja Turtles and my Toy Biz X-Men. There, I also found Zen. Zen was created by two men, the gregarious and outgoing Steve Stern and the quiet and reserved Dan Cote. We've established that Zen was an alien, hence the intergalactic part, but what about the ninja part? In the 80s and 90s, ninjas were everywhere. From mutant ninjas to American ninjas, ninjas were generally portrayed as heroic characters, and kids like me, we ate it up. Zen as a ninja alien creation was unique because he went against the trend of aliens being evil in pop culture and leaned heavily into ninjas are awesome. Now, there were bad ninjas and good aliens, but for 10-year-old Josiah, ninja good, alien bad. I was a simple kid. I was simple, but was I duped? Was Zen just created to get me to buy toys and comic books and all that stuff? And bendy figures? Or was Zen something that creative people made that they marketed because they wanted it to be a success? Let's find out.
My name is Steve Stern. I was with my folks visiting my maternal grandmother in the Bronx, and there was a newsstand under the elevated train stop, and that's where a lot of comic books were displayed. So my folks wanted to keep me occupied, and they picked out a copy of Superboy for me. And I opened that book, And the only thing I can compare it to was love at first sight. And all these many years later, I'm still, heavily involved in comic books.
Maine is where I grew up, the woods. That was my playground. That's where I would crawl around. I would look at things from a macro point of view. A lot of the landscaping and stuff, when you look at your world around you from that point of view, it's an alien landscape. Really, I wasn't allowed to read comic books. It was a time when comic books were considered iffy as an influence on children.
Well, what about the effect of these comic books on the children?
All of our testimony from psychiatrists and children themselves is directly responsible for a substantial amount of juvenile delinquency and child crime.
So my parents got a box of them one day from my neighbor. He gave me this whole box of comic books, and I just got lost in it right away. And my mom and dad decided, oh, you need to go outside. So all of a sudden that box disappeared.
He could have played baseball, but he chose the comic book instead.
I don't know my age. I was maybe 7, 8, or 9. First movie I ever saw was Jungle Book. And just like fifth row, just, God, really? You can do this with drawings? And it just blew my brains out. I was like, whoa, it's just, that was pretty life-changing. That was the point right there. I want to be an animator, that was always my fantasy. Storytelling was always the agenda. And whenever I would draw something, and I was always doodling, doodles are things that just happen. When you start doodling, all of a sudden something forms. And when I look at that, I have a complete story. I see it come to life. So I was kind of always meant to be a visual storyteller. There really weren't any art careers there other than being a landscape painter.
We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents.
I'm the only artist in the family, so they didn't really have a direction for me, but storytelling was always deep buried in there, down deep.
I started having my stories published around the time I was in college. There was this New York-based publisher called Skywald that published these black and white, basically like horror and sci-fi magazines, kind of like a Creepy and Eerie, the Warren books. So what would happen is you would write a brief one-page synopsis, you would submit it to the publisher, and then various artists would actually visit Skywald's offices in Manhattan, and if they liked a particular synopsis, then you were green lit to write the script, and then the artist would complete the story. I was kind of fortunate that one piqued the interest of Jeff Jones, who was an amazing artist who had a page in the back of every issue of National Lampoon called Idle, or Idle, I-D-Y-L. And he selected a story I wrote called Sleep, okay? And the next story, synopsis I wrote was called The Cosmos Strain, and Michael William Kaluta, known for his work on The Shadow for DC, he selected that story. But another story I submitted in synopsis form was called Zen, and that story, no one picked up on it, okay? How Zen came to be years after I had initially submitted the Zen story to Skywald, and then got it back when no one selected it. That story on one piece of paper, came with my wife and I when we moved from New York to the state of Maine. We bought a home there. I was unpacking boxes. One of them like crashes to the floor, and out flies this one piece of paper. And I look at it, and I hadn't seen it in God knows how many years. This Zen thing is pretty interesting. It's too bad nobody ever wanted to do it. I owned an advertising agency both in New Jersey, and then when we moved, I moved it up to Maine. A couple of days later, I went to see a new client, Cote's Old Fashioned Ice Cream. And by the way, Yankee Magazine, the arbiter of all things cool in New England, called Cote's old-fashioned ice cream, quote unquote, the best damned ice cream in New England. So we're not talking, just any old garden variety ice cream.
My mom's ice cream shop, I'm sure he told you that story.
I go into the office of the owner of the company, Nancy Cote, and I see these fanciful pen and ink drawings on the walls of her office, and I say, what are these all about, Nancy? I mean, you're an ice cream company. What are these, like, fantasy and other kind of pictures doing on your walls? And then she says, well, my son Dan draws those.
That he saw was this pen and ink fantasy illustration I did for a friend of mine, and it's the only album cover I ever designed.
And I'll tell you what, Steve, if you let Dan do all the art on the newspaper ads, you can have the Cote's old-fashioned ice cream account. I said, of course.
Steve saw that and said, hey, who's that?
Whoa!
I think to win over my mom's advertising business, he said, I need to talk to this guy.
A couple days later, I went and I actually met Dan in his attic studio where he was just doing some airbrushing for fun. We got to talking, and he said, boy, Steve, I always wanted to do a comic book.
I had never considered doing comic books at that point until he asked if I wanted to do one.
The synopsis of a story I had idea called Zen just represented itself to me, and maybe we should work on that together.
I had this story, and I had this drawing of this character that I had done, and this was just a doodle of a guy in a trench coat with no face, and he had this gun up his sleeve. He was like this stealth assassin cat. So I showed him that. I said, "This, I love looking at the story. I think this would fit."
Dan and I worked for about a year to a year and a half. It took him a very long time to complete the first book.
At the time I was kind of obsessed with the airbrush, so that first book was completely airbrush, and these 30 by 40 panels, and hand lettered with a Sharpie. It was absurd. The artwork holds up. It's beautiful. The original art is still as vibrant as the day I made it. Airbrushing is really a great medium.
There was Dan Cote's Zen that was first, which was like this cool airbrushed and then artsy really look to him.
And I also felt that the airbrush lent enough of a surrealistic, moody vibe that sci-fi I thought required. And I would do things with the airbrush that I don't think anybody else was doing, because I was adding texture with my airbrush. If you take a really deep look at that artwork, especially that cover, you'll see a lot of texture, like even in his belt. And just that belt, for the texture on his belt, I would stretch a nylon or pantyhose, right? Stretch them out and then spray through it. That's how I would get the texture. So I was collecting things, anything that was flat became a stencil. So I was finding stuff on the roadside, broken radiator parts, and I was using that as stencils. And that's why it's so richly textured, and I love texture. Plus I wasn't very good at drawing faces, so that's why he was faceless initially. And when it comes to anatomy, it's pretty embarrassingly bad. People embraced it anyway. Even though the anatomy's wrong or whatever, people still embraced it because it was a great concept.
And the first book was done in complete airbrushed color. However, when it came to print that book,
but we couldn't afford to print it in color, so we went black and white, right?
I printed it in black and white, primarily for cost considerations. It was a good idea also because this just happened to coincide with the time of what's called the black and white explosion in comic books, which was like mid to late 80s. And of course the Turtles was like the huge factor that made that happen. So I came out with mine and Dan's book in black and white. I would have printed it in color had it been cost efficient, but it wasn't. So it was one of those, happy coincidences. Why is Zen blue? As the artist, Dan made that choice, which I was incredibly in favor of. Blue, I think, is both our favorite color. And I will tell you this, Zen is not a white man, he's not a black man, he's not a yellow man, he's not a red man, he's a blue man, which actually allows any race on Earth to identify with him. I guess the Blue Man Group figured that out too. Dan created the Zen logo. There are actually 2 iterations of it. The original one, which we still use, and there's also what we call the more modern one, which, for example, is on the cover of the Hard Bounty series that I wrote and that Murat Michaels illustrated.
Zen Intergalactic Ninja Issue 1 is the story of a blue space mercenary, this guy, who, as we have already established, is actually in black and white in the comic. His job in this issue is to retrieve the Jewel of Forgetfulness. Here, we get everything that would go on to define Zen for 30 plus years. He's a product of movie action heroes as much as he was the ninja craze. He was Deadpool before Deadpool was Deadpool, cracking wise as he chops up wave after wave of alien attackers. Now remember, this is before the photon stick was just kind of bashing them with a stick. This was chopping them up. Steve Stern even said in an LA Times interview in 1989 that Zen was sort of the Dirty Harry of aliens. As I mentioned, culturally, aliens were bad guys, and if they were sort of culturally in movies and stuff, good guys, they were kind of depicted as, well, they were E.T. or Alf, which Steve has described as wimpy. His words, not mine. I know Alf is no wimp, just ask any cat ever.
It loves cats. Can't get enough of them.
Steve went as far as to print out pictures with E.T.'s face and the phrase, "No wimpy aliens." These were actually Zen fan club membership cards. As to the art in issue 1, it's raw, at times weird, breaking rules, because Dan didn't know what the rules were. The art works best in the context of feeling. You feel everything through the visuals. The landscape itself seems alive and everything has a state of flow, almost like viewing an amoeba through a microscope that happens to reveal a space ninja. The story is straightforward in that regard. Again, Zen is a mercenary on a mission in a hostile landscape. The ending, however, is a twist that is worthy of an episode of The Twilight Zone, or maybe The Outer Limits, or later for me, the Ray Bradbury Theater. You can very much see how it could have fit in the sci-fi and horror anthology comic Steve wrote for it previously. I believe Zen has staying power for 3 key reasons, all of which can be found here, and it's not these 3 guys. First, the anti-hero nature of Zen. He wasn't a bad guy. He was a good guy willing to do bad things. I like that. And the second and perhaps most important part was Dan's simple evocative design. It was a character that drew me in. A little blue ninja? I'll buy that toy. And I did. The final element that made it stand out was the aforementioned twist ending. Zen did a dirty job and he doesn't feel good about it. So he decides to forget. This showed that Zen was more than just a smart aleck with a bladed staff and later a photon stick. He was a real human, or alien, you know what I mean.
In so many things in life and also in advertising and PR, timing is everything. How did Zen separate himself from the pack of so many, say, black and white comic books that were coming out in the mid to late 80s? The answer is I was an advertising professional. I owned an ad agency with expertise in advertising, marketing, and public relations. And one of the modalities of PR is a service that's still available to this day called PR Newswire, where you pay this service to disseminate a press release. Dan and I complete issue number 1 of Zen. I submit it to Diamond, and Diamond says, yeah, we'll distribute this book. And we get something in excess of 3,000 orders, which I thought was pretty good. And then I said to myself, well, I'm an advertising, marketing, and PR professional. I can start getting this book more exposure. So I write my own press release and accompany it with the cover of issue number 1. And I pay PR Newswire just as I do for my clients, but I do it for myself. So PR Newswire puts out the release. And the thrust of the release is that there's a new alien comic book hero named Zen. And he's different than Superman, who, by the way, is also an alien from the planet Krypton. However, Superman looks just like us humans, but here's a true alien character. Around that time, there was a best-selling book called Communion by Whitley Strieber, which was his memoir, as it were, of being abducted by aliens, and it became a huge bestseller, and was also made into a movie starring Christopher Walken. And the cover of that book was very iconic. And the cover of Zen #1 wasn't all that different from the cover of Communion. I put out the press release through PR Newswire, and what happens when you put out a press release is you wait to see if anyone pays attention to it and reprints it, because you never know. So about 2 weeks after I put out the press release, a business associate of mine calls me up and says, "Steve, you should go down to the newsstand and pick up today's copy of USA Today." Doesn't say anything more to me, but I go, I pick it up. And there on the front page of the Life section, which is like their entertainment section, and it still is to this day, there on the front page of the Life section is my press release and a picture of Zen, big as life. USA Today was then, and I believe still is, believe it or not, the largest circulation newspaper in the USA.
USA Today, the nation's newspaper. Life, sports, money, and the nation. USA!
Long story short, within a couple days after that release hit, I had a major licensing agent and all kinds of deals coming at me almost instantaneously. My personal belief is you got to make your own luck. So my participation in that was putting out and paying for the press release. Had I not put out that press release, I doubt Zen would still be around. The lesson learned is create your comic, put all your creativity and your passion into it, but creating the book alone is not enough. You have to promote it. You have to make people aware of it. Zen was the product of a failed genetic experiment. He was born in a huge test tube apparatus. However, the experiment by the chief scientist was deemed to be a failure. However, a kindly and compassionate female scientist named Tesla realized that Zen was alive. This little creature was alive, and she was supposed to dispose of the biomatter, but what she did instead was she placed the little squirming blue baby in what's called a teapot, a waste pot in this case, and jettisoned him out into space, saying, "May the great creator be with you." She decided to save the life, and if fate were to be compassionate to him, he would survive. And of course he did, because the pod fell into the gravitational pull of the planet Om, the mystic planet Om, and Zen was raised by the mystic masters of Om, specifically Master Sattva, and he became their greatest acolyte. His skills, his meditational skills, his ninjistic skills were far beyond those of any of the other acolytes. And when he reached maturity, they sent him back out into space in a hypership that had been left by a previous traveler on their planet. They sent him out to space to find his destiny when they could teach him no more. Licensing deals are very specific. They relate to just a specific product over a specific period of time. Dan and I, as the owners of Zen Comics Inc., retain all rights, 100% of the rights to Zen. As soon as the press release hit, I was contacted by a number of licensing agents as well as other people. One of them was the major licensing agent for Columbia Pictures, and the other was a fellow who I ended up going with named Mark Friedman, whose company is Surge Licensing. Mark, Surge, read, as so many other people did, in USA Today, and then he tracked me down. And it just so happened that not too much before I connected up with Mark, he had signed a little property called Teenage Mutant Ninja So Mark was already on a roll with the Ninja Turtles, and he fell in love with the Zen concept. We signed with him. That began the roller coaster of licensing. However, I should tell you that very first licensing deal we did, there was this segment on the local news up in Maine called Dave's Main Road on the CBS affiliate there. We had already been on that show before the press release went out.
We're the team that works for you.
One fellow who saw it owned a company that distributed Mead notebooks, pens, pencils, and other implements to schools. He came up to the town of Auburn, Maine, where I was, and I concluded the first licensing deal with him, and as a result, Zen was distributed into schools throughout the Northeast, and those items are very hard to come by. Zen was initially self-published by Dan and I under the Zen Comics banner. The next aspect of publishing was the Archie books. After that came Entity Comics. The only book that Zen Comics, i.e. Dan and I, produced in full color was Zen #1, which was printed initially in black and white. However, in our 10th anniversary edition in 1997, published finally that first book in its full color glory, and that again is another book that's pretty hard to find today. Then there were a couple of interesting instances, two that I immediately recall. One is a company based in Canada called SSS Comics published the story that eventually became a Zen Bounty Hunter that is now published by First Comics. Some people know this and some don't. There was one issue of Zen published by Devil's Due in which Joe Casey wrote about a 6 or an 8-page Zen story. Business complications killed that deal after the first issue, after which we became published, as we still are today, after about 10 years, 11 years, by First Comics.
So, as you can tell from Steve, Zen's publishing history has hardly been straightforward, and frankly is the hardest part of being a Zen collector. The 90s were all about chrome covers, holographic covers, die-cut covers, or in this case, die-cut chrome covers, and Zen leaned into all of this with reckless abandon. Zen was first published in 1987, and that initial series ran until 1989 with 6 comics being published. Volume 1 was published by Zen Comics Publishing, as was Volume 2 in 1989, which was essentially a redo of this comic. This is where Zen started to get a bit more kid-friendly. For example, it's a bit less violent.
The initial book, the first book, you notice is pretty bloody. At that time, my son was probably 5 or 6. My kid can't read my book, and that's a problem. That's why we reconsidered our approach to the story, and his blade became the photon stick that we now have.
You could consider this a remaster of this.
That was so that I could reach a broader audience.
Issue 2 of Volume 2 features new art by Paul Pelletier, but is essentially a retelling of the original Issue 2. Volume 2 is also where Zen first got all earthy with the first mention of Earth Day in Zen. Issue 3 features art by Ed Grant and a totally different take on Jeremy and Zen. And finally, Issue 4 is back to Dan. Issue 4 also brought the Earth Day stuff to the front cover. And just when I thought I was making sense of all this, I realized there's also a Volume 3 of Zen Comics Publishing, and I have 2 issues of it. I really at first thought this was, well, Volume 2 at least, but it's actually Volume 3. This is the first Andrew Esposito issue. Although it's penciled by Jim Fern, it has breakdowns from Andrew and finishes by Esposito. It also says it's adapted from the novel by Steve Stern. It seems each new run, each different volume, is kind of a soft reboot, tweaking things along the way. This version features Noten as the villain, and his intro is great. Here's this giant devil-looking guy. helping the poor people of this world to save their world, and essentially he tricks them into basically destroying their own world for him. The letters page here teases the toys and features ads for the mask and a bendy toy. Volume 3, Issue 5 features interior art by Jim Fern, with a famous cover by Mike Mignola, who never went on to do anything else.
Excuse me? Couldn't hear you from all the way over there.
This issue also says that Jeremy is a descendant of the queen Zen killed in Issue 1. So it's trippy. And the aforementioned Sean Kiley, my fellow Western Pennsylvania native, in the letters page says, "Keep Zen in space." This issue also teases the animated series coming in 1993.
They also had a toy line, they had a video game, and as a little kid, I said, this is the next Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. This is going to be the next big thing.
When all of these products, the comic books, the toys, which had a comic book, and the video games, when all of these products went to market, we did not have what's typically called the foundation media of television to create awareness and push the sale of these products.
Normally, a toy company won't take a chance on you unless you have kind of like a comic book and a TV show established.
That was a bit concerning to everyone, but everything was in the pipeline and there was no stopping these products going out to market. The amazing thing that happened was everything sold without the foundation media. There was one row of Zen products on the shelves in Toys R Us, the late great Toys R Us stores, and I would talk to the manager of the local Toys R Us, who allowed me to stand at the end of the aisle to observe what was happening. On one side of the one row of Zen toys was Batman, lots of Batman, and on the other side was the Turtles, lots of Turtles. So it was kind of scary and a little daunting. Why is anybody going to go to our one row when you got Batman on one side and the Turtles on the other? But amazingly, what happened was this. The essential appeal of Zen, especially to younger people, but not exclusively, is that he's this blue dude, this blue-skinned dude, kind of like the Blue Man Group, which, by the way, also came into existence in the same year Zen did, 1987. Kids would be with their parents walking down the aisle in Toys R Us. They'd see all the Turtles, and then they'd look over and they'd see all of Batman, and then their eyes would focus on this blue alien dude, Zen, and they would pull their parents over and insist that they buy it for them.
Yep, that's exactly what happened.
Despite the fact that we didn't have a cartoon, an animated series on TV, the essential appeal of the blue-skinned alien was thankfully enough to propel the sales of the toys. That was a real blessing in and of itself. What happened was kind of a convoluted story. First of all, we signed a deal to have an animated TV show. However, that deal with the Ruby Spears Company, which I think went out of business around that time, obviously did not happen. But the concept of the show had to do with the environment. The environment was very hot and important topic then, as it should be today, even more so, I would think. Dan and I were tasked with adding an environmental element to Zen. Now, that was not the initial thrust of the book. Zen was like a solitary, mercenary, soldier of fortune, adventurer in space. But we were told that the toy company, which was interested in Zen, needed an environmental concept, which also was going to tie in with the 2 Konami video games that we got a deal on. So suddenly we were presented with a marketing situation whereby Zen had to become environmental, kind of like
I am Captain Planet.
Go Planet!
Now, this is a major turning point in the Zen saga. Dan and I were both very much environmentalists anyway, as most young people were at that time. And so we cloistered ourselves in a Holiday Inn on Long Island. Dan came down from Maine. I had already moved back to New York. And over the course of, I think, a weekend, we came up with this whole environmental concept. The recycled heroes, Zen's allies, and the contaminators, led by Lord Contaminus, his foes. All the designs were done over that weekend. A very talented fellow named Jim Fletcher, who I believe today is involved with DC Comics. Jim did the artwork that appears on all of the toy packaging. He also did the artwork that appears on the Konami video game packaging.
And the Archie covers, which might be my favorite take on Zen visually, because it's kind of the most Bruce Lee.
Jim worked very closely with the folks at Just Toys, and that's where all the tooling and the sculpting happened. But the initial designs were all by Dan. This is what got submitted to the toy company, as well as to the video game company, and as well as to the Ruby Spears company. But the TV show didn't happen. However, the toys and the video games did happen.
Battle your way through 4 challenging and complex stages, each littered with its own ecological disasters and environmentally unfriendly enemies. Brave the acid rain forest. Leap through the burning oil rig as flames lap at your feet. Tough it out in the toxic factory and the underground radioactive waste dump. Zen Intergalactic Ninja features a vast variety of gameplay, pushing the NES to the outer edge of its technological abilities. Look for dynamic, diagonal 3D views, high-speed scrolling, horizontal and vertical movement, all wrapped into one exciting action-adventure game. With Zen Intergalactic Ninja for the NES, Konami will help keep your part of the world green.
Action figures from his toy line. Of course, I have Lord Contaminus over here, which any of the fans of the line will tell you, he came with this staff that didn't fit in his damn hands, which was just ridiculous. But one of those fun things that happens with toy lines. Cool. And he had an area where you could push slime in through the back so it would squish out through the eyes. Very cool. And then, of course, they break down some of the other toys in the line, and they didn't actually produce all of these. And this is, of course, Zen. This is the main man. This is Zen. And one of the cool things with the toy line was that it also came with a comic book. So they had a comic book already attached to the toy line, which was just the coolest thing for a kid in the 80s.
And I will credit myself with the fact that the comic book, Just Toys edition of the comic, packaged with each of the toys, that was a big selling point. I don't know how I came up with that idea, but I will tell you this, not terribly long after we did that, I believe that Todd McFarlane added an issue of Spawn to his toys.
Spawn is America's #1 comic book thanks to you. So I started this company to make the toys that you asked for.
Spawn.
They come with comics.
Nice toys, kids.
Nice try, guys.
Spawn from Todd Toys. We're out to plaster the competition.
But we came out with that first.
So here I am reading this comic book, falling in love with it, and what is on the back of the comic book? The action figures that are available at the time. I was over the moon thinking, this is the next Turtles.
Just Toys closed its doors, I think somewhere in the mid to late 90s, so they're no longer around. However, the president of the company, Alan Rigberg, and I remain very good friends to this day. The Zen Bendy figure has never been and was never distributed through the normal channels of like Toys R Us and other toy stores like KB Toys. We made it to be distributed solely at comic book conventions. Over the years, thousands of them sold. Among the numerous licensing deals we did was one for Zen Halloween products, masks, and there was Zen, and then there were a couple of other characters.
This is the kind of stuff I was reading as a kid. Bright pages and the artwork and it bouncing through. This is what I fell in love with.
I also need to tie in the Archie Comics iteration of Zen to this new environmentally themed Zen book.
He was really geared for a younger audience with the Archie stuff, especially the recycled heroes and stuff.
I fell in love, like most of the kids of the 80s, with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But for me, it wasn't the Mirage Studios line. For me, it was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Adventures, which was the second appearance of Man Ray, which they end up calling Ray Fillet in the action figure line. They had the cereal boxes and they had these little comic books. That was the first appearance. But this is the second time that he showed up in an actual comic book. And this is the sort of thing that inspired me. These colors, stories, and this was around the time that I fell in love with Zen, the Intergalactic Ninja.
We had already had that deal in place. Archie was very enthusiastic about Zen, especially with an environmental concept.
All of a sudden, we had a licensing deal with Archie Comics, and there's no way I was going to be able to produce.
One of the most amazing events in my life was meeting and then working with the late, great Ross Andru, as well as his inking partner, Mike Esposito.
Ross Andru and Mike Esposito.
Andru and Esposito.
They were consummate professionals.
Who, among other things, created the visuals of the Metal Men, which I always loved. We do our deal with Archie Comics, and there's going to be a series of Zen books from Archie. They call me up one day and they say, do you feel that you'd like to have Ross Andru working on these books? And I just almost fell over because I always just loved Ross's work. For years he worked on Wonder Woman, but the thing that I loved the most was Metal Men. So when they said, here's the opportunity to meet with him, you're going to go meet him at this particular diner on Long Island, you're going to meet with Ross and Mike. So of course I went. I was just like a kid in meeting them. Here, one of my artistic idols was going to work with me on my creation and my stories.
And they were able to do incredible work with these stories.
When I was a little kid, the very first time I came across Zen, the Intergalactic Ninja comic book, I was a huge fan of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but more than just Michelangelo, Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, I was a fan of who created these Ninja Turtles. So at the top, whether it was the box of cereal or it was a comic book or wherever it was, it always said Eastman and Laird's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So even as a little kid, that resonated with me. I wanted to know who was Eastman? Who was Laird? Who are these people who created this entity, these characters, this whole world? As a fan of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle adventures, Zen, the Intergalactic Ninja from Archie, jumped out at me. This was a huge explosion for me to come across this run.
One of the reasons Ross wanted to work on Zen was he was a big alien believer. He put a lot of his input into the books, and if you look closely in the Archie books, you'll see that we have all the various types of aliens, the reptilians, the greys. They're depicted in the series we did with Archie. For a couple of years, we worked on those Archie books together. I was apparently the last person to talk on the phone to Ross. The next morning, passed away, had an aneurysm, gave the eulogy for him. at the funeral. Ross and I became great friends. He was an amazing talent. We wrote a tribute to him in the front of several of our books.
We then have the Archie run, volumes 4 and 5, or volumes 1 and 2 of Archie. I have to admit, I'm already confused, but there were 3 issues of each run here. Archie once again softly reboots Zen and Jeremy's first meeting. The key differences being the bad guys Lord Contaminus and his Contaminators and the recycled heroes. As a kid, I thought this was a separate universe, a continuity unto itself, as the Turtles cartoon and the Archie comics were clearly in a different universe than the black and white comic. Here we learn that Zen was a millennia old and that this comic was created to sell us some toys. We meet the recycled heroes, Canet, Pulp, my favorite. I like that character. I think he's the most potential out of all of these. I'm just affinity for something made out of newspaper and old paper pulp that kind of looks like the Thing. Bottle Bandit, Lone Ranger, who was kind of like, what, Jolly Green Giant Jr.? Wasn't that a thing in the 90s?
Well, Sprat.
Ho, ho, ho.
Ho, ho, ho.
Green Giant. And Lights Out, battling Lord Contaminus and whoever his minions are. They're very reminiscent of the Captain Planet bad guys, where you have a bunch of weird mutants and one attractive female human. Affirming the toy line is the key, issue 2 features Zen's rocket sled, which came with his action figure. I lost mine. And I should also point out that you think Archie Comics and Zen would mean that Zen would like battle Jughead, hitting him upside the head with his photon stick. But no. The Archie series, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, like Sonic, and even The Adventures of Bayou Billy.
The Adventures of Bayou Billy.
These comics were less 1950s teenage drama and more kicking and punching, so 1990s teenage drama. The first Archie run, Volume 4/Volume 1 of Archie, was a 3-issue miniseries telling the story of the group's origin. And you can also see the influence of Metal Men and the recycled heroes. Volume 5/2 of Archie was supposed to be an ongoing series, but there were only 3 issues. With that, the third explicitly states the story would be concluded in issue 4. This story, called Rumble in the Rainforest, was never resolved. We never had the completion of this story. I'd love to see the final chapter of the Rumble in the Rainforest. The letters page even notes it was originally a 3-part story that became a 4-part story. But again, we never got part 4. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we didn't get part 4, right? We get cheesy gems like calling them cosmically cool, and each toy came with a special version of issue 1 with a red bordered cover. Some fun moments include Zen shrinking the toy size, clone dinosaurs, which is another example of Zen leaning into stuff that was popular in the 90s. In this case, clone dinosaurs were very popular, thanks to a pretty significant movie based on a book.
What's an easy meal? Each sold separately. Look for the JP mark. It's happening, but only at Jurassic Park.
We get a mention of the negotiation for the cartoons and an Archie retelling of Zen's origin. As a kid, I thought that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics from Archie and the Zen comics from Archie were actually in the same universe, so that when you saw Archie Adventure Series, that meant that those two would eventually do battle. I so wish that could have happened. They both have the same feeling and a similar kid-friendly setting and art style. All that said, the Zen series from Archie, it could have been as epic as that Ninja Turtle series, which I think went something like 70 issues. However, it never really had a chance to take flight. In 1993 though, we got another comics from Zen Comics Publishing, with another famous artist doing the cover. With Sam Keith's cover for the Earth Day special. This is actually the last comic before Entity Comics made Zen a whole lot more grown up, and it teases Entity at the end. To me, this is the first Zen comic that really leans into the 90s collector's boom. So does that make it like the most 90s comic ever? In the comic, Steve actually states that it was a direct response to the death of Superman.
The original Death issue has already become a collector's item worth up to $75.
At this point, I'm done even attempting to try to figure out what volume came where, because in 1993, Entity Comics gave us a lot of comics. Now, these aren't all from 1993, but plenty of them are. Now, I'll be back to help work us through all this, but first, let's hear the story from those who were there to live it.
Beginning of the 90s, it started out kind of like dark and edgy.
In the early 90s, I co-published Zen with a great guy named Don Chen, who created the radioactive black belt hamsters.
Was my kind of my claim to fame. It sold well. We did about 20 issues with Eclipse. So after that, I was doing some other projects with Eclipse in the 80s after the hamsters kind of ran their course. Not very long, like in the late 80s, they started to have some financial problems. We kind of saw the writing on the wall. My friend Bill Mouse and I, who worked on a parody called X-Farce. So at that time, X-Force by Rob Liefeld was kind of breaking all sorts of records. So Rob was just kind of becoming a big superstar.
Okay. And you created X-Force?
Mm-hmm. So I thought, well, I like X-Men, and I think I could spoof X-Force and kind of the X-Men universe. I proposed X-Farce to Eclipse.
I decided when I moved to San Diego that since I didn't have any friends or responsibilities or anything, that any job that I would get out there would be just something art related. Didn't matter what it was, like, you know, climbed the ladder, so to speak. The animation studio for a while, worked on Attack of the Killer Tomatoes for Saturday morning TV. I brushed t-shirts in a mall for a while, caricatures at SeaWorld and at the San Diego Zoo for like a few years.
So Bill and his friend Bob, they were both those guys that when you go to SeaWorld or to an amusement park are the ones that are doing the characters.
One of my friends that worked with me in SeaWorld, his name is Bob Hannon. He is the reason that I was actually able to get my first gig in comics. So he would brag every now and then that, oh yeah, comics, I know an editor, I know somebody, I know people in comics, I have friends. So I egged him on. I was just like, well, why don't you get a job? He actually started reaching out and he got a job. He got a gig doing a book for Eclipse Comics.
And they had a friend that was an editor at Eclipse at the time. And I think they kind of sent her some submissions of their work.
He couldn't finish the job. The deadline was super tight. That job ended up being X-Farce. I ended up penciling the whole thing because I'm very fast at penciling. He was faster at inking, so that's what he did. And then the writer on that book was Don Chen.
That's actually probably out of all the books that I've done, probably the best-selling single issue. But that was the very first book Bill Mouse and I ever worked on. So Bill and I launched Parody Press along with my wife and his wife. And that was like in the early 90s, and we just continued to do spoofs of anything that was popular in the day.
I'm not exaggerating. It's got to be 70 to 100 different parody one-shots that we did over the course of maybe 6 to 8 years. It was doing well enough that we actually became our own competitor. And parodies, I mean, they're great, they're fun, but you can't put out like 4 or 5 of these things a month for years without having some fatigue.
And then that got really big, and we decided, you know, maybe we should branch out and do like more mainstream stuff. Steve came to us and said, I'd like to partner with you guys. You already have your publishing arm set up, and I'd like to write Zen and co-edit and publish it with you.
And we had a company called Entity Comics.
Entity Comics actually came about because Don Chen and Steve Stern had contacted each other about publishing Zen. So I suggested that we should have an imprint that's just for sci-fi, action, superhero comic books. My wife at the time, we both put our heads together a little bit, came up with the word Entity.
Entity published a lot of Zen titles for the next several years. Bill Mouse became one of the key artists on Zen.
I was the artist and writer for Zen Intergalactic Ninja for quite a few years.
When we got to Entity phase, the Archie comic phase was over, and the Archie comics, of course, were aimed at a slightly younger audience.
And they kind of watered down the Archie series that was, you know, more like a kiddie version.
Now it was time for us to evolve into the next stage in Zen's development with Entity Comics.
And all of a sudden these characters are actually out there being dark and edgy and actually fighting for their lives in a way that felt tangible.
And Steve came to us and said, you know, I really want to make Zen more gritty. Kind of like when McFarlane was starting to come into his own. A lot of people were emulating Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man and Spawn.
You know, I'm looking up to these image guys like, you know, Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane and Mark Silvestri, and you know, I want to be as good as those guys. Those guys are like my touchstone. I'm going to reach for that. And so I was very fortunate to be able to design the character the way he was and have the more Image Comics, action adventure, you know, superhero kind of proportion.
And there's been a lot of people that are famous that kind of got their start with our company. And Sam Keith is one of the guys that started with me on the Hamsters, and then he went on to do Sandman and the Max. Very organic, super detailed.
And that's when we put out the chromium cover Jay Lee book, which many people have collected.
So we were actually on spinner racks all across the country. We had to kind of publish thousands of issues in advance and then send them to a distribution center. And so they would just kind of put them all over the United States. Zen was one of the few independent comics back in that day that actually had newsstand distribution.
And that book started with a retelling of Zen's origin. Tatsuya Ishida, very, very talented artist, did the interior art on that book with the Jay Lee cover. However, we still retained the environmental theme, but on a more adult, kind of scary level, that the contaminators, these were really mean dudes. So it was just a kind of a scaling up of the environmental theme. But eventually we moved away from the environmental theme, and Zen basically reverted to what he originally was, a solitary space adventurer.
Before we even started working on that issue 0, and we were actually just putting things together, when we were talking about launching the new story, I'm a 90s guy straight through. All the guys that I was actually a big fan of, they were in the process of breaking off and forming Image Comics. I want an action book that's like on that level if I could pull it off. I want Zen to have the proportions and the musculature and the agility and of a Spider-Man type character, of a Deadpool type character, more action adventure. I wanted to be geared for a general audience. I got a huge opportunity because I was untested, untried. The only thing that made it any kind of work was the fact that there's a certain amount of content I would have to produce in a given month.
Bill he's really fast, so I really like working with Bill because he's really good at deadlines. But on top of that, he would do like 2 or 3 issues a month.
So there's 24 pages of this story, and it's got to be good. It's got to be whatever your best is. They let me redesign the character. They let me change the proportions of the character. They let me be the writer on the book, which wouldn't have lasted past an issue if the sales had just tanked. So luckily, the sales were great. I was doing well and ended up being the writer and the artist on the book for actually a few different miniseries. I did the first series that we did. I did another one called the Alternity Saga. I did one called The Hunted, which was Zen basically being hunted by a doppelganger of himself from another universe. I was allowed to introduce my own characters into the story, which is a huge, thank you, Steve and Dan, for allowing me to do that, because I still publish those characters to this day.
Still doing stuff today with his character Nera X, which made her debut, and I think she was in the very last page of Zen 0. And then Zen number 1, she kind of teams up.
Under the banner of Entity Comics, came up with a concept, Zen Illustrated Novellas. And these were prose stories with about a half dozen black and white penciled illustrations. We put out about a half dozen of those. They all sold quite well. And then my recollection is a few months later, Marvel came out with something called Marvel Chillers. For example, there was Marvel Chillers featuring the Hulk. Peter David wrote a prose story that was accompanied by incidental illustrations. And again, I know that we predated that. I'm not saying Marvel saw it, but they may well have. I've just recently reintroduced this concept. It's now called Zen Illustrated Fiction, just because I didn't really think they were of novella length, but they're more like short story length.
This is where I come into the story, with a story. Other than me being an incidental character in this whole thing by buying some Zen toys and comics in 1993, I'm going to be writing a story for Zen Illustrated Fiction. And thus far, it's been a joy to write, but first I have to finish my novel, The Paperboy, which does have a Zen reference in it.
One day I'm walking in the mall, the Green Acres shopping mall in Valley Stream on Long Island in New York, And down at the end of a corridor, I see this guy airbrushing t-shirts, and I'm just stunned by what I'm looking at. I mean, this guy was amazing. I go up to him, I introduce myself, tell him I'm the guy that wrote and created Zen, and he did know about Zen. Quite a few people by that time, mid-90-ish, were familiar with Zen if they were at all into comic books, right? They read about us in Wizard or wherever. Guy's name's Joel Orbeda, and I eventually am able to convince him to work on a story. It turns out to be a 3-issue story of about 71 pages, which has now become known as the Rawhead Saga. After Joel works on Zen, he decides to go off into other areas of art, pop art, fine art. Over the ensuing decades, becomes known as L'Amour Supreme. He's no longer known as Joel Orbeda, and he's a worldwide recognized pop artist whose work has been exhibited in galleries in Stockholm, in Tokyo, in Berlin, and in the US, of course. I reconnected with him about a year ago, and we talked about the fact that his first and only comic book story was Zen. And we decide that we're going to reprint it for the world to see, and for all of his fans and Zen's fans to collect. And it becomes Zen's first ever Kickstarter campaign, including the cover of issue 6A, which is the very, very first piece of not only Zen, but any comic art ever published. And that book has become incredibly difficult to find anywhere. Anyone happens to have that book, I think they should hold on to it.
As I said earlier, Zen released a lot of Zen comics and a lot of miniseries, so there's a lot of number 1s and number 0s and all that, so it makes it a bit hard to track. And for the most part, they're all called Zen Intergalactic Ninja, and there are a lot of number 1s. First, the Zen Sourcebook, which yes, is a number 1, had tons of helpful info, both for this video and just in general. At the time I enjoyed it because it just gave me access to the behind the scenes of what it's like to make a comic and the history of that comic in Zen. And of course, the people that made it. It also mentioned max trading cards, which we didn't get other than a few that were inserted in some issues of like Young Zen and stuff. Those were supposed to come in 1993, but they didn't come. Entity's run began in June to July of 1993 with Bill Mouse and the Alternity Saga, which, as I said earlier, is the first Zen comic that I ever read. It came with a certificate of authenticity. It was signed by Bill Mouse. This one's actually signed by Steve Stern more recently. He actually did it right over there. Hey Bill, you need to come to Huntington Beach and sign this here for me as well. In November of 1993, we got Zen the Hunted and Young Zen, both driven by artist-writer Bill Mouse. The Hunted in particular is like a wonderful explosion. In various comics from these runs, we get some really key information that the cartoon is going to be coming in 94 or 95. There's a cool Name the Fan Mail contest, Z-Mail eventually wins, and a letter is printed concerned that Zen might get burnt out. Young Zen told a story of Zen in training along with a few other future intergalactic ninjas? Ninja? Zen and the other dudes are sent on a training mission, a sort of quest. Along the way, people need help. Zen wants to help, the others not so much. But Zen's goodness, it rubs off on them. There's also a former student who captures the master who turns out to be a robot. You know, comic book stuff. In December of 1993, we got the famous J. Lee Chromium cover, along with Zen, finally, in color. The Zen Color series used the Contaminators as the bad guys, but they were much more edgy and scary than they had been in Archie. In Archie, they were cartoon bad guys. Here, they were bad guys. Speaking of Archie, in March of 1994, we got the Milestone Edition, which is, again, just the Archie run, but now with a Bill Mouse cover. Now, I love Bill Mouse, but at least for Archie, I prefer the Jim Fletcher covers. I should also explain the continuity at this point, or at least attempt to. Zen and his star child Jeremy had their story retold or reprinted a few times at this point. But the stuff by Bill Mouse took place roughly 300 years before all of that. April of 1994 was a very Spider-Man-like month for Zen, with issue 2 of the Color series, 2 specials, Spring and April Fools, and Zen Star Quest issue 1. The April Fool's special features a great send-up of the whole variant cover thing, a brief appearance by Black Hole Bob, whose first appearance took place in the Christmas special from a few years prior, and his third appearance will actually be coming in Zen Bounty Wars coming soon. In May of 1994, we got the first Zen novella with Mistress of Chaos. The novellas are certainly the most grown up of Zen. They're kind of a bit of a crime noir, maybe space noir? Sci-fi noir? StarQuest is probably the closest to a big sweeping space epic for Zen. StarQuest would tie the Color series for the longest running Zen series at 7 issues each. Maybe 8, I'm not sure if I counted issue 0 or not. And I don't even know if this one has an issue 0, which is really my biggest problem with Zen, the numbering. Zen leaned into the gimmicks of the 90s, fancy covers, number 1s, number 0s, but I so wish Zen had legacy numbering. It could be like Spawn or Savage Dragon today. Zen is a big character that spans centuries, and there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 issues of Zen adventures out there. However, as a collector, it's hard to track them down and see sequentially how many I have. I took great pride as a kid and into my adulthood collecting every issue of New Mutants. I actually sold all that to buy this house. But with Zen, it's even harder because it's not just 1 to 100, it's 1 to 7, 1 to 3, 1 to 7, 1 to 3, and so on. And I love Zen, and I have a stack of comics, but it's just a bunch of miniseries. The Entity run ended in the later part of the mid-90s. L'Amour Supreme, then Joel Urbeta, was hyped as the next big thing, which he very much was, just not in comics. At last, Entity Comics came to an end. In the later 90s, Zen published a handful of comics once again under the Zen Comics Publishing imprint. These include Manga Zen, Shoujo Zen, Zen, The New Adventures, and a crossover with the Barbie twins for some reason. Hey, it was the 90s. The problem was, Zen's audience had kind of aged out. We grew up. At least speaking for myself, I grew up and I didn't take Zen with me, at least for the time being. I left Zen in the toy bin and in the short box.
Theories on it.
I've always felt that aliens, which must exist in a universe as shown by the James Webb telescope, on the billions and billions of worlds and star systems that comprise our universe, to me, there's no question that there are other sentient beings in the universe. And it's my belief that if they have devised the technology to travel vast distances through perhaps wormholes here, they're not going to be the aliens in Independence Day. They're going to be highly evolved. I believe that one day it will be revealed that there are other aliens here. We owe it to ourselves not to fear them.
In 1999, Zen was wiped out by Y2K. Fortunately, he returned in April of 2003. He was still published by Zen Comics Publishing and just called Zen. And what was frankly one of my favorite stories. There's a moment in here where there's this great devastation and Zen and Yura can't really do anything to fight anybody, so they're just trying to help people. It was a truly great moment and showed why they're heroes. This run was written by Steve Stern with art by Bill Mouse. I also love these comics because the letters page, they look exactly like a website from 2003. I wonder if that Yahoo fan club still exists. The next series came in January 2005, and Zen was now a bounty hunter as it was Zen Bounty Hunter, and also he had a new face.
Zen's physical appearance has definitely changed over the decades. Dan's original conception facially is that basically Zen has eyes, there's no mouth, there's no nose. That certainly worked for us for a long time. Certain people in the industry said Zen resembled a blue Spider-Man, but of course Spider-Man has a mask on, that's why you don't see the features. What happened with Zen's face is kind of analogous to when we added the environmental theme to Zen, by which I mean to say we had quite a bit of movie interest. There were a couple of actors whose names I will not mention who wanted to be attached to Zen. We were optioned for films twice. The movies just didn't occur as a result of those options, because that happens a lot in the quote-unquote development process in Hollywood. Anytime an actor spoke with me about portraying Zen had a concern, which was that their face wouldn't be seen. I had felt prior to that I wanted Zen to have a face. I wanted him to have a nose and a mouth. And then when Actor to a Man said the same thing to me without me prompting them at all, I decided to give Zen a full face. And it's explained in a graphic novel called Zen Bounty Hunter. This was written by myself and drawn by Bill Mouse. It's a black and white book of about 50 pages. And in it, I basically explained that as a result of a delayed aspect of his genetically engineered birth, he grows a face. I must say that Dan was a bit concerned because he always thought that Zen should retain his initial aspect. But turned out that, Zen now has a face.
The first time Zen had a face came in Zen the Hunted #3. Zen and Nira were hunting a Zen from another dimension. That Zen gives Zen a freaky nightmare mouth. Although it seems like it was a dream, also Bill and Steve seem to have a kind of a compromise with it that they discussed on their Bounty Wars live stream. Where Zen's face mask that acts as a breathing apparatus, it gives Zen that classic Zen look.
The other aspect of Zen's physicality that has definitely changed over the years and decades is his physical build. Zen started out as kind of like the typical diminutive gray alien. Zen was not very tall. He was kind of buff, but he was a small guy. Zen is now a pretty big, buff guy. Again, this is just part of the evolution that so often happens in comic books, whereby, characters die and then they come back, their costumes change, aspects of their physicality change. I can't justify these changes, they just happened. I happen to prefer Zen with the face and the bigger, buff body type, but that's just me.
I prefer the more squat, tiny Zen because it reminds me of my toy I had as a kid. He always felt like a blue space alien Bruce Lee to me. But despite his changing appearance, Zen remains Zen. And he's the same character, no matter the art. The indie airbrush fluidity of Dan Cote, to the very Spider-Man-like Zen by Ross Andrew, to the buff Image Comics-esque version by Bill Mouse, and the many that have come since, and the current one with a face, and any potential will have in the future. He's still Zen. For me, the greatest appeal of Zen is the character. First, yes, there is the visual appeal, which we've established, of the blue alien with a photon stick that maybe looks a little bit like Spider-Man.
You'll find the Spider-Man!
But the character I like in Zen 2 the most is Deadpool. Deadpool was kind of Spider-Man with swords, pouches, and a foul mouth, which I love. However, I wouldn't be surprised if maybe a young Rob Liefeld, somewhere in Anaheim when he was a kid, read an early issue of Zen as he was breaking into the industry. Zen is a bit like Superman, an alien hero protecting the Earth or space, so still protecting Earth, I guess, with the dexterity and wit of Spider-Man and the edginess of Deadpool. As Steve Stern said, he's a bit Clint Eastwood, but maybe he's a bit more Jean-Claude Van Damme, who, at least in the 80s, had a whole lot of charm and a twinkle in his eye. He's very much an action hero, as quick with a kick as he is with a quip.
What if I was this guy? What is he going through? He's alone, going through these things. He's hurt. He's trying to figure out his way through. Sometimes he's like a Han Solo, kind of a badass Clint Eastwood kind of guy, but then sometimes he's everyday Joe, where it's just like, my ship sucks. He's a very interesting character. I really like Zen.
Zen is a product of all the comic books, of all the movies that Dan Cote, Steve Stern, and later Bill Mouse, and then later every other creator that contributed to Zen ever read. That's who Zen is. He's like all characters. He's built out of all these things we ingest, we take in, and then we build our own creation. He is a unique original creation built on this massive, awesome inspiration. For me, and why I prefer Zen without a face, is because he's a blank slate. He was a character that in toy form, I told his story. He'd fight along the X-Men, the Ninja Turtles, maybe relax in Castle Grayskull, or the Barbie Dreamhouse. Zen is and was Untold stories that I got to tell. As a writer, my creativity first came from my toys. I didn't just play with them. I had stories that the action figures lived out. They became characters. They became alive. And that's who Zen is for me. And that's why he still appeals to me.
I never got to meet Steven until a few years ago. I happened to be at a Comic-Con in Las Vegas, and I saw some artwork of Zen. And they were advertising that creator of Zen was there doing a signing. I geeked out, and I couldn't believe that the man was actually there in the flesh, that I could talk to him, that I could meet him. And so I immediately ran around the convention to buy copies of his comics. They always say, don't meet your heroes. I was full of questions and signed everything for free. And he was just genuinely excited to talk to a fan of his work. And we bonded over comics and publishing and writing and the crazy Hollywood industry. We became friends. And I was happy and so excited to not just meet the man behind something that I grew up loving, but to know that he's also a good dude and that he deserves all the credit and respect in the world. One of the cool things about being friends with Steven Stern and being a peer is I get to book panels at WonderCon, San Diego Comic-Con, some of the biggest pop culture events in the world. And so I've had the pleasure of having Steven on my panel at these events. But Steven Stern is super cool to have him there.
The Zen Bounty Hunter story, as it initially appeared, was in 2005. So since 2005, which is quite a few years now, Zen has been a bounty hunter. We introduced Zen's robotic manservant, Tinhead, Unit 64H is his actual appellation. The relationship between Zen and Tinhead has become kind of iconic in the Zen mythos. When just a couple of years ago, the Mandalorian phenomenon occurred and continues to occur, we saw a sudden increase in Zen due to the fact that he also is a bounty hunter. A few people accused me of jumping on the bounty hunter wagon after the Mandalorian series started, but the fact is Zen has been a bounty hunter since 2005. A couple of years ago, we published Hard Bounty, which is written by me and drawn by Murat Michaels, who's a great friend and a great talent. The first printing of that book sold out immediately. The second printing is almost all gone now, and there'll undoubtedly be a third. But that's quite a bounty hunter opus. I've written the sequel to Hard Bounty called Bounty Wars, and that is the subject of the next Kickstarter campaign. So for the foreseeable future, Zen is remaining a bounty hunter, and I'm kind of steeped in the whole bounty hunting genre, which often includes a lot of Western stories. I got into bounty hunting many years ago watching a show called Wanted Dead or Alive, starring Steve McQueen. You can see all the black and white episodes on YouTube. I've always loved the bounty hunting genre, and that's where Zen is going to squarely stay until undoubtedly the next step of his evolution, which I don't even know what that might be.
Zen bounced around with a few different publishers, including Saul Colt's SSS Comics in 2005. SSS Comics only published Zen Bounty Hunter before going out of business. Then came Devil's Due in 2008 with a story written by Joe Casey. Now, comic fans watching this will know Joe Casey quite well. He's written everything from X-Men to Superman and co-created Ben 10. It seemed like it would be Zen's big break, but it never went anywhere, which unfortunately has kinda to a degree been the story of Zen. Zen is currently published, and for about the last 10 years has been published by First Comics. Now First Comics has a long history going back to the early 80s. They're one of the first independent publishers, and frankly, one of the few independent publishers that's a true independent publisher that's lasted so long. And what First Comics is doing is creating new Zen stories such as Bounty Wars via Kickstarter, which is a sequel to Zen Hard Bounty, also by First Comics, and also giving us things like the More Supreme Zen, again thanks to Kickstarter, and hopefully maybe a Bill Mouse omnibus? In the early 90s, Bucky O'Hare, Space Cat, James Bond Jr., the Skeleton Warriors, the Pro Stars, even the Mighty Ducks, and so many more all got a season of animated awesome. Why couldn't Zen get at least one season in about 1993? That series would have tied back to the toy line, the video games, and the Archie Comics, so it would have leaned heavily into the environmental theme. However, Ruby Spears was going through some things at the time. In 1991, they sold most of their catalog to Turner Broadcasting. The company officially shut down in 1996. However, it seems that when they sold off that catalog in 1991, that was the real end of the company. It was functionally still active, but wasn't making anything. The Zen toys were released in 1991. It's highly likely the cartoon would have come that year or shortly thereafter. But for all intents and purposes, the company with the license to make the show was not a thing anymore. As to the film rights, Zen was optioned twice in the 1990s. One instance was actually promoted on several issues of Zen at the time. It was to be produced by Philippe Diaz, a French producer known mostly for documentaries at the time. The most Zen-like thing on his resume being Heavy Metal 2000, which obviously came after this would have happened. The screenplay was written by Chris Solomon, or Solomon. I'm not sure how to say it, but I really want to get it right. So I'm saying it both ways, because The Odyssey from 1997, which he wrote, is way better than you think. I recorded it on VHS and watched it over and over. And it's worth mentioning that my daughter's name, Penelope, comes from The Odyssey. Frequent horror guy Brian Yunza, who produced Stuart Gordon's Reanimator and co-wrote Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and produced the live-action Guyver film, was attached to direct. These films would have leaned into the edgier Zen of Entity Comics, and would have very likely had a PG-13 rating. The second time Zen was optioned was by Peter Chan of 8 Celestials Entertainment, a company based in Shanghai. The film would have been produced using the same stages where Spielberg's Empire of the Sun was filmed. A Hong Kong action movie of Zen in the 1990s would have been mind-blowing. Like, my head would have exploded at 16. Zen has been poised to be the next big thing for 37 years and counting. I conducted all of these interviews, did all of this research, and writing my own Zen story because I love Zen. And I want more people to know about Zen. Zen's the indie rock band that only you seem to know about. But every time you tell someone, they fall in love with the music. But one person at a time takes a while. For a 90s Pittsburgh kid, Zen is the Clarks.
This is has become for us a little bit of a Western Pennsylvania folk song.
There's a penny on the floor and you're gone.
A band essential to our lives, vital to our souls, but never really revered outside of Pittsburgh. But in Pittsburgh, they are legends. I think about Zen, and I think about what we almost had. A cartoon, a movie, the vehicles on the back of the box. However, what I do have is a huge stack of comics, toys I can now share with my daughters, and a future full of Zen stories. For the last 10 years, First Comics has been Zen's publisher. First Comics has actually been around longer than Zen, and famously in the 80s gave a lot of future comic stars their start, with comics geared more towards fantasy and adventure. Again, Zen is that indie rock band, and Zen's audience might not be broad, at least not at the moment. But thanks to Kickstarter, First Comics can directly reach those fans. Zen's not filling up arenas, but he's packing the Troubadour every single night. Now, beside the back issue bins, where can I find Zen?
There's one thus far collection of seminal Zen stories. It's called The Best of Zen, and it's published by and available online from First Comics.
More of Stephen's work signed by him, and it opens up with a history of what he did, what he created.
And there are other books forthcoming that will compile many of the 100 or so stories that have been published since 1987. In The Best of Zen, we republish a number of the Archie stories, We also happen to have in that book the full color Zen #1. And there are a couple of other stories that we put in the Best of Zen, which were never published before. So that's a very good archival volume to get, which I said is available from First Comics.
Zen has had 2 successful Kickstarters in 2024, with the More Supreme Zen and the first issue of Bounty Wars both funded, with more on the way. On the Dan Cote side of Zen, you can find his graphic novel, The Zenith Orb. It's kind of a classic Zen story, with a modernized version of Dan's original and unique take on Zen.
That Zenith Orb book, I'm very proud of it. That's my first ever independently written and drawn book that I did, and it's 90% created in Adobe Illustrator. I'm really proud of that book, and that actually took 4 years to make, actually.
There's a new Zen video game coming. It's coming from a Ukrainian video game developer who has been very successful with several of his games on Steam. That's the platform where it's put up and then people download it for the various other platforms. That's been delayed a bit, but he's nonetheless still working on the game from whatever bunker he's in or however he, has himself situated. My understanding, I'm about to soon see some of the first work on the game, is that it's a retro style game that does encompass the environmental theming. This particular developer, he grew up on that game and always loved it. Over the years, we have been approached by some smaller toy companies to create new Zen toys. I think that will happen. I'm currently working on the screenplay for the Zen movie with a director friend, and I do believe that all things being equal, maybe within about a year, there will be a Zen movie. It'll be shot on a smaller budget, maybe a couple of million at most. Once there is a movie, no doubt be on the streaming media, maybe a short theatrical release, they kind of do that. I do believe that once Zen finally gets that mass exposure, which you could say he's been waiting for since 1987, I feel there'll be a whole new batch of licensed items, including toys, video game that's currently being worked on, and who knows what else. Being around for 37 years and surviving and thriving and selling over 3 million comics over that span of time for a initially self-published book is more than I could have ever wished for.
As it is with anything, when you try to accomplish something, not everybody gets you. Not everybody understands. And there have been people online, I've seen it, I've read the comments when Steve does an interview on a YouTube channel where they call him a grifter, or they say he was just trying to take advantage of that time period, like Cowboys of Moo Mesa or Biker Mice from Mars or any of these other things. But to that, what I would say, what kind of a guy jumps on something to make a buck and then runs with it for 30 years? He's still doing it because he believes in it and he loves it. And as I understand it, I believe there's an animated movie that's in the works right now. Zen is a great character, and whether it goes with the ecological side about Earth and recycling, or it just goes on interplanetary fighting and battle, the point is, he loves it, he runs with it, he believes in it, he's still pushing it, and he has lots of other great creative ideas. And he's a good dude, and he deserves all the success and all the respect in the world.
Some people have questioned Steve Stern's intentions, saying he's a marketing guy, that Zen was just trying to cash in, the environmental stuff was a cash in, that this thing was a cash in, that whatever Zen was doing was just to make money. Was he trying to cash in? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean he didn't love the product. As a marketing guy, Steve knew that the most critical part of selling a thing is to make sure people are aware of it.
Hopefully enjoy it.
Most writers, myself included, are bad salespeople. We need a little bit of Steve's gusto in that regard. I certainly do. Steve continues to tell people about the character, both because he loves the character and because he knows the vast potential therein. Fortunately, Zen's future is as bright as ever. Well, maybe not as bright as 1994, but pretty close. And there's a whole lot of things to look forward to. Maybe action figures, maybe the animated film, probably a video game, definitely comic books. But there's going to be stuff out there for you Zen fans, for Zen fans like me. In the letters page for Archie number 3 called Galactic Communications, a fan named Brian Shiflett wrote in asking, "When I'm old and gray, will you still be selling Zen comics?" The editor replied, "As long as all of you loyal Zen fans keep supporting us, we'll continue to bring you the adventures of our favorite alien hero." As one of those fans, maybe not old, but older, and ever more gray by the day, I'm looking forward to reading them.
Good stories just come from you. If you're writing stories just because everybody else is writing stories like this, it's not honest. But if it's something that personal, then it's real, and those are the best stories.
Awesome. That's all I think I have.
I think it's all I have. I'm drained. So that's enough, right?